Good morning. My name is Dr. Bruce Williams from the Department of Veterinary Pathology here at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. It's my pleasure today to have a new installment in our series, Legends of Veterinary Pathology. Today I'm going to take the opportunity to bring someone in front of the spotlight where he normally tries not to be, to talk a little bit about some tremendous contributions which he's made to veterinary pathology. Dr. Sam Thompson might not be the most famous pathologist out there, but his contributions to our field have been of great benefit to all veterinary pathologists in the last 30 or 40 years. We want to talk about that a lot today. It's said that George Bailey in the film It's a Wonderful Life surely had a wonderful life, but I don't think that he can really touch the many careers of Sam Thompson. Hopefully we'll be able to touch on some of them today. Just to give you a preview of what we'll be talking about the next couple of hours, I had the opportunity to look at Sam's CV, and we're going to be talking with a man who has published not 1 or 2 books, but 5 books. He's written over 60 journal articles, and he's had at least 3 careers, and maybe some that I don't know about. His first military career, he has held a chairmanship or a chief of division at many military institutes of research, including the chief of the Department of Veterinary Pathology at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. He is also chief of the pathology department at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute in Panama, the Medical Research and Nutrition Laboratory at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital, and also has been a senior pathologist here at the AFIP. In his second career as a civilian pathologist, he started with Ciba-Geigy as a staff pathologist and rose through the ranks to manage their toxicologic and pathology laboratories, and ended his career there as a senior research fellow in research and development, of which there are only 6 of those at the time. Most importantly, and what I'd like to focus on today, Sam has touched the entire veterinary pathology community, whether most of us know it or not. Earlier in the series, we had the opportunity to talk to Carl Jones, who founded one of the 3 largest veterinary pathology organizations, the American College of Veterinary Pathologists. Well, today we'll be talking with the man who is the founder of the other 2, the Society for Toxicologic Pathology, and of course our very own C.L. Davis Foundation for the Advancement of Veterinary Pathology. Sam has held the position of president of the STP, and he also is an honored member of the Society of Toxicologic Pathologies. In the C.L. Davis Foundation, his job title has changed several times. He has been the National Programs Director. He has been the CEO. Currently, he is the president. No matter what the job title is, we've always called him boss, and we hope to for many years to come. So, Sam, I want to thank you for coming today. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you.
Well, I'm very happy to be here.
As is customary with most of our tapes, we want to take you or for you to take us all the way back. We often start with the earliest recollections of our guests, and we'd like to know a little bit about how they grew up, how they got into veterinary medicine and on into veterinary pathology.
Well, I was born
Okay.
in Moberly, Missouri. So was Omar Bradley. So was Jack Pershing. I don't think that's why I chose a military career, but there were a couple of famous men from that town, and then there was me. But I actually grew up to about the 4th grade in a little town called Fayette, Missouri. And I can't remember a time we didn't have dogs and cats around the house, and ponies and the like. And I had a very dear friend who lived across the street. His name was Dr. Munn. He was a graduate of the old Kansas City Veterinary College, and he used to take me with him out into the country when he made his calls. And I kind of wanted to be like Dr. Munn. And I think that's where I became interested in veterinary medicine, probably about age 7 or 8, tagging along after Dr. Munn. Then after I reached the 4th grade in Fayette, Missouri, my parents moved to Chicago, Illinois, where my father was a sustaining artist with NBC radio. And I still had a house full of cats, alligators, you name it, I had it. And I can't think of anything that I really ever thought of being other than a veterinarian. I could say this, that I've often thought that, I went to Iowa State, I've often thought that here I got to study what I wanted to study and become a veterinarian, and all my life someone has given me a living to do the thing that I enjoy doing the most. And so I think I'm very fortunate, because so many people spend so much of their lives working at a job they don't like so that they can have Saturdays and Sundays and the evening off. And here I've been on holiday all my life.
Now, we know that you got your doctorate in veterinary medicine in 1946 at Iowa State University at the tender age of 20 years of age. Now, that's about as young as I can remember anyone becoming a full-fledged veterinarian. How did you get through so quickly? And do you have any recollections of your training days?
Oh, yes. World War II was on its way and then was here. And my father was a reserve officer. He was called to active duty back before World War II, when we had President Roosevelt had mobilization. And I can recollect that my father decided that I'd better get an education because I was too young to be drafted, and I better get as much education as I could before I did go in the service. And as it worked out, I managed to finish 6 years of college in 4 years, because we had an accelerated program then. And in the accelerated program, we didn't have summer vacations, or only vacation we got was Christmas.
How many days did you get for Christmas?
From Christmas Eve to New Year's. And I actually graduated with the last group to go through in this accelerated program. The draft board decided by the time I was old enough to draft me, I was a senior in veterinary school, and that they would rather have me as a first lieutenant in the veterinary corps than they would as a private in the Army, I guess. And so I finished the veterinary corps, and the veterinary school. And I had 2 months before I was supposed to report for active duty. So I went back to Chicago, and I worked as a staff veterinarian for Curtis Candy Company Farms.
I wanted to mention Curtis Candy. What is Curtis Candy?
Well, Curtis Candy...
Or who is Curtis Candy?
Curtis Candy used to be Baby Ruth, Butterfingers, Jolly Jack, candy bars. And during the Depression, Otto Schnaring, who was a genius, he invented the penny candy bar so all of us poor children could still have candy. And he was Swiss, and he dearly loved dairy cattle, and he bought a whole group of farms around Libertyville, Illinois, and he used the milk in his own candy factories. And I got to be a staff veterinarian for 2 months there, and very enjoyable experience. I certainly learned how to clean a cow and how to deliver calves, and the fact that they never are born except in the middle of the night and the like. And then I went on active duty in the Army there at the old Chicago Quartermaster Depot.
Before we start talking about your military career, any recollections from your veterinary days? Anybody who, from vet school, anybody who might have influenced you? Obviously, somebody pushed you down the road to pathology. Although I know you've done virology and just about everything. in between. But any recollections of?
Yes, there was a very famous pathologist, one of the founders of the ACVP. His name was E.A. Benbrook, and he was a professor of pathology it was Iowa State College then. It wasn't Iowa State University. And I liked him a great deal. Most of the students seemed to fear him, but I mean, I liked him because I thought he had a wit and that he really was concerned about the students. And of course, I do believe that pathology is the foundation of all medicine. And so I had a different attitude than some of the students. But I remember the students used to, they would mimeograph. I was trying to think of the word before Xerox. Mimeograph their lecture notes of E.A. Benbrook's lectures, and then they would sell them to the next class coming along. And what they didn't know, that it wasn't any use to the next class because E.A. Benbrook rewrote his course every year. That's the type of man he was. But then one of the other professors there in the department was Hilton Smith. Hilton Smith was the professor of pathology for T.C. Jones. T.C. Jones later wrote Veterinary Pathology with Hilton Smith. He was my professor of pathology at a different school. He was at Washington State, then he came to Iowa State, then he left Iowa State and went to Texas A&M. And so then when he retired from Texas A&M, he came up here and hung out at the AFIP for a year. And so a lot of young pathologists got to meet Hilton Smith, but I was fortunate enough to have him as my counselor for 3 years in veterinary school. Very, very fine gentleman, very kind-hearted. So I guess I just got to associating with pathologists. And then my classmate was later became a very famous pathologist, Frank Ramsey. And Frank Ramsey was the oldest man in our class, and I was the youngest, and he sort of kept me out of trouble. But he's gone now. So there was my early contact with pathology.
It appears that you, after the Curtis Candy job, decided to make good on your promise to go into the military and straighten it up. You were commissioned as a first lieutenant after Curtis Candy, and your first position was overseas.
No. First position, I was sent out to Camp Cook, California. Okay. And the Army put some horses on the post. This was United States Disciplinary Barracks, Lompoc. Now this is very famous because a lot of Nixon's White House staff spent some time there, but as inmates. But at that time it was just military prisoners. And I was the veterinarian for the prison farm. And we had 7 horses. We were a mounted veterinary detachment. And our main function out there was to take the ordnance officers out into the field and try and locate all of the artillery duds that Patton's tanks had left around Camp Cook when they were training there before they went to Europe. And during that time, I can remember as the ranchers in California weren't very happy with George Patton because he ran his tank all over their farmlands that were sort of ranch lands that were confiscated during the war, or not confiscated because they gave them back, but they took them to use during the war. And so the Mark Clark, who was the commanding general of 5th Army, 6th Army, he directed that our veterinary detachment would accompany all these trail riding associations, the Portola Trek, Conquista Vistadores, Ranchos Vaqueros, you know, riding up the California coastline from ranch to ranch, from San Diego to Eureka. And we spent about a year doing that quite frequently, and the veterinary soldiers liked that. They were outfitted with boots and breeches and the like.
Now, when you went up the coast, this was mounted?
This was on horseback.
This was one of the last mounted military veterinarians.
Right. But we had some difficulty with the ranchers, because an Army horse used to walk at 3 miles an hour, trot at, I forget what it was, just like shifting gears, canter at a given speed, and then charge was all hell broke loose. But these ranchers, with all these silver saddles and ornamentation that they had on these horses were slow, and we kept walking away from them, you know, and it rather infuriated the ranchers that these old Army mounts, who were, the youngest was 14 years old, that we just didn't seem to have any trouble with the long trail ride, and they were having a great deal of trouble.
And this was just to pick up spent rounds or ammunition or duds. How did
No,
you?
this was to provide veterinary service to the trail ride, and what we did was we traveled with a lot of camphor-rated oil, needles and syringes.
Okay.
And this was public relations. And we enjoyed it thoroughly, but public relations began to wear thin, I think, after about a year. But the trail rides were rather interesting. I remember people who were on them, like Bing Crosby and Leo Carrillo, the Cisco Kid, and I think there was a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan.
On the trail rides.
On the trail rides. He wasn't president of anything at the time, except I think he was president of AFRA, or American Federation of Motion Picture Artists or something. But he was a good horseman.
Okay, now I know that in '48 you went to Guam.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Guam and '48. It wasn't just Guam that you were taking care of. You were taking care of the.
We were taking care
Marianas.
of Guam, Tinian, Saipan, and it was rather interesting because there were still Japanese troops, renegades, up in the mountainous region of Guam, and they used to come down into camp at night, and they really weren't doing anything to us, just trying to find food and water. But it wasn't unusual to wake up and find a strange little fellow in your tent. He'd turn and run, you know, but it was rather interesting. And we were trying to introduce to the island of Guam again swine and cattle, dairy cattle. And part of our job was that the natives were collecting garbage at the Army messes to feed their swine. And they were collecting the garbage right along with the steel wool pads that were being used to clean the pots and pans. And swine don't get along very well on these. And they call you up and tell you, they had one phone in each village, they'd call you up and tell you that some pigs were ill, could we come right out? And we got out there. What they really wanted was they wanted us to put them down because they got to eat the meat after we'd done the autopsy. Mm-hmm. And the cattle didn't do too well either. I think we sent over Holstein Friesians and
in the tropics?
Right. And they were dying quite readily.
Then you stayed in the Pacific Theater, went to Japan at that time,
Well,
1950.
Yes. Right, went up to Japan, and in Japan I was stationed at the Tokyo Quartermaster Depot, and I was made the veterinary food inspector for what was called Camp Tokyo. So I had the circuit of the officers' clubs, the guest houses, the service clubs, inspecting the kitchens, and I guess I went as far south as Yokohama. And it was interesting.
No animal requirements or labs, or just straight food inspection?
No, except I remember that we had, I just thought of the Turkish people today because of the earthquake. And I had an order come down to go buy some virgin lambs for the Turks for some religious festival, Ramadan or something. And I was supposed to buy a couple of dozen head, and I had to go searching all over Japan to find these critters. And then after I found them to the best of my ability, I figured if I bought them young enough, they were virgins, right? So when we shipped them to Korea, and the Turks got a hold of them, they complained because somehow or other there were one or two in there they claimed weren't virgins. And
I'm intrigued as to how they could tell.
I am intrigued too. I never found out because I don't speak Turkish, but I was really kind of flabbergasted.
Following that, that was your last overseas position until you went to Panama, correct?
Right.
Then you rotated back, 53. It says in your bio you came back with General MacArthur. Now I'm assuming that you came back at the same time. That you...
General MacArthur was relieved by President Truman, and he left Japan, and I got orders to move my family back to the States by boat. And incidentally, this boat coming back across the Pacific developed a list. So we came back from Japan. One deck we weren't even allowed to use on the boat. It was at an angle, and we got into Seattle and got our car off the boat, which had been pounding one set of bearings because of the list. Had to get that fixed, and we drove down to San Francisco in time to catch MacArthur's Welcome Home Parade. So I followed MacArthur around quite a bit.
I suppose you're lucky you didn't end up in the Korean conflict, because most of the troops, I understand, at least started in Korea before we had time to really ramp up there, was from Japan.
Right. Basically, I had completed my tour in Guam, and but I was frozen in the Far East, and the freeze was only for 6 months, and they moved me up to Japan, and they seemed to like what I was doing in Camp Tokyo and procurement, and so they left me alone. When my 6 months were up, why I came home with MacArthur. He came earlier, but
and
a
his
few
ship
days.
Probably didn't list.
His ship probably didn't
side.
list. But so that was my experience with General Douglas MacArthur.
And now we come to sort of a different phase of your military career when you first started into research.
Well, I was assigned from Japan to the building right across the campus, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, Veterinary Medicine, Division, Department of Virology, under a very fine pathologist, Fred Maurer. And Fred Maurer was followed by Ralph Anslow. Mm-hmm. And I learned about viruses. And it was a rather interesting assignment. I also I'm trying to think of who was the colonel that was in charge of the deputy, Gockenauer. Now there's a real hero, in my estimation. He was on the Bataan Death March, and I liked him very much. And so I got to serve with, I think, some very well-known figures in veterinary science, Maurer and Gockenauer and Anslow.
Mm-hmm.
And
But primarily virology at that time.
yes, but I was basically being also trained in food chemistry, but that's rather cookbookish. And but from there I was sent to San Antonio, Texas, to take over the food chemistry laboratory of the 4th Army Area, a medical laboratory.
Right.
And so I spent a little while there. Am I looking at the right dot?
Yes, I think you are.
Okay.
Your next assignment I find somewhat intriguing. Very few veterinarians get the chance to go back to their alma mater and head up the Department of Military Science and Tactics.
Oh, I enjoyed that. I'm trying to think who was the colonel in the veterinary corps that was there. And he came down with hepatitis, and he had to be replaced. And Iowa State's agreement with the veterinary corps was that it had to be an Iowa State graduate. Well, it looked all around, and the only remaining Iowa State graduates on active duty was the chief of the veterinary corps and Captain Thompson. So the dean said he would take Captain Thompson. He didn't want General McNellis.
Now, this position was primarily overseeing veterinarians in ROTC, or the whole
Right,
wide undergraduate gamut?
The veterinarians in their first and second year of veterinary medicine had to take ROTC. We were a land-grant college. I believe it was a university by then. But they had to take ROTC. Then in their senior and junior year, they took it because we paid them $25 a month. And I used to take these cadets, a contingent of them, generally in their sophomore year, to Fort Sam Houston every summer for summer encampment. And I think I made the trip 4 times.
That was probably Camp Bullis up there. And
that's right.
which hasn't changed. It's still as hot and miserable these days as it was back then.
Oh, it was then. I remember another very famous veterinarian, Gordon Vasura, who at one time was director of the National Medical Museum. And Gordon, while we were camped out at in pup tents at Camp Bullis, he managed to put his sleeping bag down on an anthill. And he had quite a time. Lots of bites.
Was it just a summertime encampment, or did you give training classes and
we were there
instructed in close order drill during the school
yes,
year?
We were the only veterinarians probably that could drill. And we were there 6 weeks with them. And we, the big event each year was we got a string of Army buses and we took the cadets to the King Ranch for the biggest barbecue they ever saw. And that was a very interesting outing. That was the end of the encampment. Then we would come home and get ready to teach them how to be food inspectors and the like. And in the interim, while I was doing that, I decided to take some graduate courses, and I managed to get a master's degree while I was there. I actually almost got a PhD, but I was lacking a few hours of attaining this. And I remember going into a man by the name of Merchant, who later became dean. Well, he was a dean then, but he wrote the Merchant and Packer, Veterinary Bacteriology. And I said, well, Dean Merchant, what am I going to do? I can't finish this PhD. And he said, you're going to write a thesis on the introductory research that you did on rabies. And we're going to give you a master's degree. And then you can come back within the next 5 years and finish up. So that's what we did. Only while I was writing the thesis, you should like this, my son got the mumps at school, and I came down with them too. So children are great for bringing home diseases.
Absolutely.
So graduated from Iowa State, and my graduate professor was E.A. Brenbrook and William Monlux, another famous
very prominent
pathologist. And from there, when I was through with that assignment, because they closed down the veterinary ROTC at that time, clear across the country, I was sent to the AFIP to became an office mate of Charlie Barron.
And I do want to touch on that a little bit. We've used this book before when Carl Jones was here. This is the only artifact that we have in the Institute. This is what we call the Green Book. It holds the Wednesday Slide Conference attendees from 53 to approximately 57, and there's not a tremendous amount of information, but everybody that attended the conferences, when they started in 1953, everyone that attended the conferences was signed in, and also the program. And then as I was going through, I noticed the first, I think the first entry, there's in July of 1956, there is a Major Sam Thompson. Sometimes it's a Major S.W. Thompson. Sometimes it's a Major Sam Thompson. And I wanted to ask, there's some other names here over the years which are written on the same pages with yours, and I was sort of going to get some of your recollections on some of these people, because
oh, there were some fine people here.
The names in here are just, most of us know them by reputation. You had the opportunity to actually study with a lot of these people. I guess we have to start at the top with Carl Jones. Talk about Carl a little bit.
Oh yes, that's when I first met Carl Jones. And as you know, Carl Jones has been a trustee and a board member of the foundation since its inception. And he was busy writing his book on veterinary pathology with Hilton Smith. Then another person that was here was Charlie Barron, very, very famous gentleman. And another person that I had, Fred Maurer, was stationed here by then. And let's see, my friend Donald Yost.
Right. Don Yost is in here.
And then we have a gentleman who later wound up being a professor of pathology at Kansas State, and I'm trying to think of his name. Bernard Skoll was here.
Right. Bernard Skoll was here. At the time, I guess Carl Jones was the head of the department.
That's right.
What was the department like back in '56?
We were right inside the front door. As you come in where this reception desk is now, you turn right. We were the first 3 doors. And Charlie and I were the first door. And I'm trying to think of who some of the other people were. I would say that I had it on the tip of my tongue, but I don't. So
well, I can supply you with some of the names. Of course, And some of these...
McCulley was here.
McCulley was here. There's a Lieutenant Gressimer.
Griesmer was from Ohio State.
Mm-hmm.
He later wound up being in charge of the National Toxicology Program.
Colonel Sassmore.
Old Dan Sassmore was here. Oh, yes. He was Air Force. And so was Charlie Barron. And there was another Air Force officer here.
There's Recomper?
Ray Kemper. Jack Ray Kemper.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Now, he went to Florida. And I think he was... I think he was with one of the state diagnostic labs there, maybe at Kissimmee.
Now these days, the Wednesday slide conference is probably a little different than what it was back then. These days, the slides are given out as unknowns, and the residents will prepare a presentation. They're at risk for being called on to present. What were the conferences like back then?
Oh, that was pretty much the same, except we had to use these carbon arc projectors, and we were always being reprimanded because we weren't keeping the glass moving enough because we were trying to, and we were burning the...
That's right. We still have some of those slides. The carbon arc, I think when I came here back in the late 80s was the last year of the carbon arc. We used to call them Big Bertha. It was a gigantic machine which you couldn't hardly talk over, and it would burn the slides up.
Right. You were more worried about burning some specimen than you were about giving the right answer. But I had an advantage, you see. Charlie Barron wasn't going to have his office mate. He was tutoring me, looking foolish. So I really got grilled twice, once by Charlie before the conference, and then at the conference, TC would take over. And it was just about as hot and unpleasant it is sitting under these lights. You know,
So TC was a tough taskmaster.
Yes. And I always found that was very strange because as I got to know him through the years, he's really a very sweet
gentleman.
But I think he was just being plagued by all these residents, and he was trying to finish his book and getting ready to retire. And
another person who retires on a regular basis like yourself, but always picks up a busier career the next time around.
Well, you know, he retired and went to Angel Memorial.
Right.
And by that time I was in Panama. But I had a very good friend, who was General Blunt. I think he later became one of the Surgeon Generals. But at the time, he was a commanding general of the Medical Research and Development Command. And when I was in Panama, they were planning, President Johnson was planning on building a new canal. And they were surveying different sites, and General Blunt and General Heaton would call me up here, ask me to go look at something, call me up here to question me about it. You know, and then I could go visit my family in Denver. And at times I got assigned to other places to go, like up to visit Carl Jones at Angel Memorial.
For what reason were you?
Well, I actually was sent up there because there was a Department of Public Health at Harvard, and the head of the department was a nutritionist, and he was on the advisory council to the Surgeon General on research and nutrition, and there was still some things, reports being wound up from the days when I was at Denver.
Now, you did do, and throughout a lot of your career, you were interested working in the area of nutrition Intravenous Elementation. Tell me about, because I don't know if it's still operating, your department at Fitzsimmons.
Well, the facility at Fitzsimmons, when I went out there, the Medical Research and Development Laboratory and the Surgical Research Laboratory were combined. And we had some very distinguished people at that laboratory. One of them went on to, he was Lieutenant Colonel then, commanding the Surgical Research Unit. He went on to become a Surgeon General. And you'll excuse me if I don't remember his name too well. But at the Research and Nutrition Laboratory, I was head of the pathology department. And as junior staff on the pathology department, we had Jack Farrell, president of EPL now.
Right.
We had Ronald Duncan Hunt, New England Regional Primate Research Center and co-author of Veterinary Pathology with T.C. Jones. We had, oh, if I don't remember, we had Charlie Davis.
I was about to say, this is Denver, and of course,
Right.
Dr. Davis spent a lot of his career. This is where you first met?
This
And
is where,
we'll come back and talk
right,
about
so,
Charlie Davis later on.
and I'm trying to think of some of the others. There was another young fellow who has since retired, but he went with Ronald Hunt to New England, and he became a big expert on reproductive diseases of animals.
Well, that always makes me think of McEntee. But
McEntee was a different one.
I'm sure that'll come to us. So, but you know, at Denver, and a lot of us spent most of our military career doing, you know, diagnostic work or research work. But back then, it appears that you had to run the gamut. You ran the labs. You ran the department. You were much more than just a bench pathologist in those days.
Oh yes, oh yes. I also wrote the book on histochemistry and selected methods in histochemistry and histopathology while I was at Denver. And I did this because T.C. Jones sent me upstairs to work with Frank Johnson for about 3 months while I was here as a resident.
Who is still here in the Institute,
Right.
still working?
And I became a very fond admirer of Frank's and got very interested in all these things I could do with special stains. And quite frankly, I didn't like any of the textbooks that were written because they didn't tell me how to make the solutions and this, that, and the other thing. And so I decided I can do as good as that. And I started out writing just a little manual for our laboratory and wound up writing this book.
Writing the book, and we'll talk about that later on. I also want to go through your CV and some of these intriguing articles that you've written and find out a little bit more about them.
Well,
But I want to go on because we're only
Wallace was a dear friend of mine,
Okay.
and he was killed in Holland while he was here at the AFIP. And he got me interested in nutritional pathology. He also had a monkey in his laboratory that every time I was OD, he used to like to throw a pan of water at me when I walk in the lab. But he was a very fine gentleman. I dedicated a book to him.
One other person we were talking earlier who you also met while you were OD here at AFIP in the South Elevator.
You're right, that fellow Missourian, you know, Harry S. Truman. I was OD, and one of the things the OD did at that time was you got on the elevator and you made the rounds around the various...
OD being Officer of the Day.
Yes, Officer of the Day.
Better make sure we...
I was in command of the post from 5 o'clock until 6 o'clock the next morning. And so, but you had a definite group of places that you were supposed to check in during the night and the like for your report. And I went down and got on the elevator on the first floor, the south elevator. No, I guess it's the north elevator. I forget what direction we're going. And it went up when the door opened for me to get in. Here was Harry S. Truman. He had his hat off. And I got in the elevator, and I think I said some very sagacious thing like, "Good evening, sir," you know. And he wanted to know where we were going. I said, "I'm going up to see General Marshall." And General Marshall was a patient here at the time. And the president said, "Well, so am I." And there wasn't a Secret Service agent with him. He was all alone. And I later have read that he used to take great delight in eluding the Secret Service and sneaking off by himself, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the one time, and now they've torn that building down, and feel rather sad.
Okay, we've gotten assigned.
Pershing had occupied that same suite, General Pershing.
Okay. Okay, what I'd like to do, we've gotten a sign that we need to break for a little bit. When we come back, I want to talk about, actually we'll start in 1959. You received your diplomacy in American College of Veterinary Pathology, so I want to get your input on that experience and if it's changed at all these days. We want to talk a little bit about Panama when you come back to Rare, and then we'll go into some of your civilian exploits.
All right.
So let's take a break.
Okay.
Hello again. I'm Bruce Williams. I'm here with Dr. Sam Thompson for our Legends of Veterinary Pathology series. In the last tape, we found ourselves in Denver. I wanted to jump back just one moment because there was a name that came up that we want to recognize back from your A5P days, and that was Dr. Cook.
James Cook. Yes, I remember him very well because James Cook, Bernie Skold, and me, moi, we went down to attend the atomic energy course at someplace in Tennessee, this big center. It's near Knoxville.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I met John Rust.
Uh-huh.
And that's where all three of us met John Rust. And we had a nice time down there learning about the atomic bomb and atomic energy and the like.
Especially when you were staying here at the A5P, an atomic bomb
proof
building.
Where the roof leaked.
Where the roof leaks, that's right. And it still leaks 30 years later.
But Jim stayed on here at the AFIP, and I think he retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and took a position as head of the pathology department at Kansas State.
Okay. Wanted to go back out to Denver, where, of course, you work with Jack Farrell and Ron Hunt and Charlie Davis. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the nutritional work?
Norval King is
Norval King. I was going to say that, but I already blew it once with McEntee, and I didn't want to take a second chance. You want to tell us a little bit about the nutritional type of work that you were doing, irradiated foods, and
well, that's one of the laboratory's mission was we had about 40 contractors at the universities, medical schools, studying the preservation of foods by irradiation. And the concept was to, well, literally, let's irradiate a truckload of beef and drop it in the tropics with no refrigeration required. And so they had all of these various studies designed to prove that this was safe. And so I got the task of visiting these various schools, seeing if they adhered to the protocol, if they had any troubles with if the foods were harmful in any way, and also to arrange for the irradiation of the various diets. That's when we had the reactor blow up in Montana. And I don't know whatever happened to the radiation preservation of food. I don't know many foods that are preserved by radiation.
I was shopping last night and I didn't see anything
Right.
that was irradiated on the shelves.
And I think, but it is in the books. We could do it if we had to.
You're also busy with intravenous alimentation in Denver.
Oh yes, they wanted to develop a fat emulsion which we could drop by parachute into the Arctic or the tropics, and we would have a high caloric intravenous solution for the treatment of individuals who had gut wounds, which is the most common type of wound that a soldier gets from a ballistic.
Mm-hmm.
And these various emulsions caused febrile reactions in the people, and we kept trying different formulations and different type of stabilizers. But it gave me the opportunity to visit the laboratories of the MDs and the DVMs that were on that task force, and that's where I met such people as John Humans, who was the dean of Vanderbilt and later was a advisor to the Surgeon General, and Dr. Raymond Mong, Hans Popper.
Mm-hmm.
Spent several weeks over a period of several years in his laboratory at Mount Sinai in New York, and Dr. Fenton Schaffner. Now these gentlemen, Popper was a pathologist, Schaffner was a gastroenterologist, but they wrote liver disease.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another individual on Dr. Popper's staff by the name of Tibor Barca, and he was a Hungarian, and he had written a book on histochemistry, and the communists were going to publish this, and we removed him from Hungary in Operation Paperclip, and he was brought to the United States with manuscript, and Tibor had to get it translated, so it became Barca and Anderson's histochemistry. And he became a close associate over the years, particularly on this intravenous alimentation program. And I wound up supposed to write a summary report collectively of the whole study, and I wound up writing another book. It's called The Pathology of Intravenous Alimentation.
Just couldn't stop yourself. Had to write another book.
Well, I had to write another book, but that one, very interestingly, sort of became the basis for the formation of ASPEN.
Aspen?
American Association for Enteral and Parenteral Nutrition. And virtually all hospitals have a section within their dietetics department for parenteral and enteral nutrition. And it was very interesting.
Now at this time, you also became a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Pathologists.
Yes, Charlie Davis, who was a consultant to my laboratory in Denver, sort of took me under his wing, and we studied as best or what time I had to study, and I took the examination, and quite frankly, I didn't pass all parts.
Mm-hmm.
And
now how many parts were there?
there were 4 parts.
Still 4 parts.
And I passed 3 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but you see, in those days, it wasn't multiple guess or marked sense. It was essay you had to write. And if you knew too much, you'd never get through the examination.
You
And
didn't write another book.
you can't write another book. And I didn't pass that part.
The essay was the one that
I didn't get through enough questions.
and that is still a problem with people taking the. Now, how many people took it at the same time you did?
Oh, I think there was about 6 or 7. Charlie Barron was one of the proctors of the examination. And I remember after I got through writing the examination, Dr. Coffin, who was on the examining committee, came in and said, "What happened to you?" And I said, "I just didn't get enough answers." And he said, "Don't you know in taking the examination that you go through first and answer everything you know and then go back?" And I didn't play the game plan right. But I took it, that one part again the next year and passed it. And I was the 17th examinee.
17th examining. That's it, because it started in 53. I think the first test was in 55. You passed in 59, and
they'd only had 3 or 4 each year.
It's amazing, because now we have 70 to 100 each year.
Right. So.
And how many people passed that year?
Jim Cook did. I did. Don Yost did. I don't know the rest. There didn't seem to be that many in the room. It wasn't a big affair. It used to be held at the Northwestern Medical School down on the lake shore in Chicago. And it was always held the Friday after Thanksgiving.
A one-day test or 2-day test?
2-day test, Friday and Saturday after Thanksgiving. And that was the coldest spot in the world, I think. But and they didn't tell you to bring your own microscopes. Then you used the medical students' microscopes, which wasn't a very good idea because you were going in and working with something you weren't familiar with, and that some undergraduate had already goofed up.
While you were at Denver, I wanted to touch on a couple of things. Can you tell us a story about the, I want to call it the bear story?
You remember the Strategic Air Command in the days in the Cold War when they had a certain number of wings aloft at all time, and they were being accompanied by fighter planes. But these bombers could fly at a higher altitude, I guess, than the fighter planes. And occasionally the pilots would black out. And by the time they came to again, some of them were they crashed into the ground. And the Air Force, when he's blacked out, the pilot isn't pulling the ejection cord in the capsule. And the Air Force also thought, well, if he did pull it at that altitude and he hit the ground eventually in that capsule, the shock would probably kill him. So they devised a mechanism which was known as the shearing device, where they took up the impaction on the capsule by blades that passed through steel tubes. And this would dissipate all of the energy coming down. But they still needed a way to know when he blacked out, and they were going to hook up EKG to the pilot, and they had some gadget that they had invented to trigger the ejection mechanism if the EKG went down. And so to test this out, Stanley Aviation got the contract out in Denver at Stapleton Airport. And the Air Force imported, I think it was about 40 Himalayan bears. And everybody said, why Himalayan? Because they were the right size to fit the capsule and in a sitting position. And so we would narcotize the bears. We were doing this from the Denver laboratory for the Air Force. We would narcotize the bears so they didn't mind being strapped in. We were running an EKG on them, and we had leads all over their body and the like. And they would take them up in a cargo plane and shove these capsules out and then monitor the bears coming down with the EKG as to what point in time it would trigger the mechanism. And of course, after we got the bears down, well, we had to examine the heart, and nearly all the officers out in Denver had bear rugs. But basically, they claim we stopped the loss of fighter pilots that were accompanying the strategic bombers.
Interesting. Another thing I want to touch on, you're not only an author and noted raconteur, but a published artist here, Denver Museum of Art.
That's right.
I did not know.
Well,
I've not heard that story.
Then you hadn't heard that story?
I've not heard that story.
Well, everybody thinks pathology is dull and uninteresting, and it is, I guess, if you only have H&E. But during the time I was writing the book on histochemistry, we were taking a lot of normal tissues and running special stains on them, and then we were using a photographic technique down at the medical school in Denver called dye transfer. And this was a forerunner of color photography. And we were taking enlargements of these various histochemically stained normal tissues. And the tissues of the body, as you know, are beautiful. The kidney is beautiful, the pattern of the liver is beautiful. I could go on and on, but I mean, it is very intriguing. And the curator of the Denver Art Museum heard that we were doing this, which were basically just illustrations for the book. And they came out to see me and wanted to have an exhibit of patterns in morphology. And this ran at the Denver Art Museum for several months. Every school child in Denver got to see it, and I gather it was quite a hit. If you can look at a transverse section of the kidney and decide it's beautiful.
I think you can. Surprised you didn't become an artist at that point for a while.
No, I gave up art when I was a schoolboy in Chicago, up through high school. I got a scholarship to the Art Institute, and so I got to go down, I guess it was one afternoon or 2 afternoons a month to the Art Institute. And they decided I'd never amount to anything because they would have human models there. I don't mean nude models, but human models, and we were supposed to draw them. And I found the human not too interesting. I'd be doing things like drawing the head of a horse or the head of a fox terrier or something like that.
Okay, after you left Denver, then it was off to Panama for a couple of years.
Yes.
Once again, providing pathology support as well as just about everything else, running the laboratory, virology, bacteriotox probably.
Yeah. Basically, it was a small laboratory. What had happened was, and also visiting the various medical laboratories of our South American allies, the Colombian Army, the Bolivian Army, the Guatemalan Army, etc. And I was on a trip to Medellin, which is famous now for another reason. But there was a hospital in a town near Medellin called San Juan dos Dios. And I was inspecting some work that we were having done there. And our president was assassinated in Dallas. And we received frantic messages that all military would return to the base in Panama, which I did. But I had a very harrowing drive with a soldier in the Colombian Army who didn't speak English, and I spoke no Spanish, and he was driving very fast. And returning me from this hospital to the airport in Medellin, they were holding the TWA plane, and no, Pan Am plane, and at the airport there. And when I came aboard by the, I was just a lowly lieutenant colonel when I came aboard, why the ambassador from Guatemala to Colombia was on board the plane and came up and expressed his condolences on our president's death.
I think we all remember where we were at the time.
Right. And I remember being at the ACVP annual meeting out at the University of Chicago after Thanksgiving and going downtown with Don Yost. And we were looking at the Christmas windows and wondering how we could do this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how we could go on behaving this way. Very intense shopping going on.
So, any other remembrances of Panama that you want to mention? Because then it's back to rare again.
Oh yes, when they after the president was assassinated, Johnson froze all construction overseas, and so the Middle America Research Unit was stopped dead in its tracks. And you know, there was foundations up and so forth, but nothing ever happened again. And so I kept getting other assignments coming down from General Blunt. And one of them was that somebody had proposed building a canal through the Darien India country, and General Heaton wanted to know if I thought that was feasible, and I told him no one's ever been able to get through that, including the engineers that are proposing it. The Darians use poison darts and the like, and then they proposed putting a canal through further north, and I went out on the east and west coast of Panama to look at the potential site and report back the medical problems that I might envision. And I think I was at cross purposes with the command surgeon down there, because this would have been a big build-up, but Gockenauer and people of Walter Reed also were very much aware that medically it would be a tremendous problem.
So we didn't get the second canal. Why did we need another canal?
I don't know why we needed it, because wasn't it Eisenhower who gave it back to Panama? And it isn't our canal anyway, anymore.
So after Panama, you came back to Walter Reed?
Yes.
To the Institute of Research?
Institute of Research at Walter Reed.
And you were working on a survey for...
Well, Colonel Gockenauer had two hats. And he was in charge of the Department of Bacteriology. But he was also deputy director of the Institute. So he set me up in his director's office and had one interview with me and said he wanted me to survey, that he saw that he had lots of pathologists assigned to Walter Reed, but none of them seemed to be working in a pathology department. And so my job was to go around and find out how many of these officers were pathologists and to devise a means that we could supply the whole institute and the facilities out at Rare with a centralized pathology laboratory, which I never headed because I got transferred after I turned this in. I got transferred to the AFIP.
Was the survey well received when you turned it in? Or?
Oh yes, that's the way it's organized today. And many of my friends have had the privilege of serving as chief of the department. And but I'm sure at the time I made lots of enemies because every one of these departments had their own pathologist or pathologists. And they didn't like giving them up, but it was very wasteful of pathology talent. You know, it was almost like, I'm better than you are, how many pathologists do you have? Or, you know.
So your last military position was back here at the AFIP?
And Bloomberg, General Bloomberg, later I guess he was Surgeon General, but he was a Brigadier General here at that time. He was here. And so was Garner.
Right, Dr. Garner, who's
Dr.
also...
Garner, he was head of the department, and I was simply put down here as a senior veterinary pathologist. And then Bloomberg loaned me to a gentleman by the name of Kuhn, George Kuhn, who was a Brigadier General, and he was chief of the Veterinary Corps.
So what time did you know it was time to retire and go back into civilian life?
Well, George used me for quite a few projects, and but he was coming up to retirement, and I thought that I probably had incurred some wrath of people along the way on General Kuhn's behalf, and it wouldn't be a bad idea since I was eligible if I retired. And so I proposed to him. At that time, retirements were frozen. And he said, anyway, you can't retire, you're, you know. But I said, well, I think I need to, General, because I think when you retire, all the people that have it in for you are going to take it out on me. So he said, well, I have one last project. You take care of that, and I'll approve your retirement, and I'll get General Heaton to approve it. So that was it.
That was it.
21 years.
21 years.
But that last project was, Kuhn had an idea that we were using the wrong type of dog in Vietnam. We were using police dogs. And he was a good veterinarian. And we were having, the police dog had to be exercised at the end of a leash and a handler. We were losing a lot of handlers and a lot of dogs from booby traps. And George said that we need wind centers. And preferably water. What do they call them? Amphibians. But I mean...
Water dogs.
Water dogs. And we need somebody that said, well, I never worked a pack of dogs when I was hunting on a leash. You know, so we went out to the University of Maryland, and they had an Army research contract in the psychology department. And they were just using dogs basically as models as to how fast you could, Pavlov's principle, how fast we could train dogs to perform certain feats, because we were taking 6 months to a year to train a police dog, and we found that we could train the wind centers to go on point and be controlled by a handler who wasn't anywhere near the fighting. And so we used that principle. We took over a facility out at Edgewood, and we bought young wind centers, retrievers. And then the people at Aberdeen designed a collar for us that was a toggle switch radio. And we tested this out. The dogs would work far ahead of the troops, go on point, the toggle switch would quit jiggling. You'd know they were on point, and we would call for artillery and take care of the Kong. And we quit having ambushes.
Interesting.
And that's, Bloomberg gave me an oak leaf cluster at my retirement for what we called them was biological sensors.
Saved a lot of lives.
Saved a lot of lives, but we didn't talk about dogs. That would have gotten us in trouble. So we talked about biological sensors.
Biological sensors. Okay, so you retired from the military back in 67, 65, 67.
Somewhere there.
Went to work for Ciba.
Yes.
Ciba Geigy.
Yes.
This was in New Jersey?
Yes.
How'd you hook up with Ciba?
They were searching for a pathologist. And some headhunter called me up. You know what a headhunter is?
Absolutely. I talk to them on a regular basis. Not always.
And wanted to know if I was, and I was here then.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know I was going to retire. Would I consider going up and interviewing for this? I thought, well, gee, that's a nice thing. My wife and I can spend the weekend doing that. And so we went up there. And they offered me, they offered me more money than I'd ever seen as a lieutenant colonel. But not as much as pathologists make now in industry. But I mean, it looked like a nice deal. And when we first flew into Newark, used to be such a dirty airport, and you drove through the city of Newark to get to the highway going to Summit, and it just, boy, it didn't look good. But the people at Ciba took us the opposite direction. They took us west, Morristown area, which is beautiful, to show us where the houses were. And we took the position, moved up there from Washington. And they had
Were you the first pathologist at Ciba?
Oh, they had people they were calling pathologists, but I was the first pathologist at Ciba. They had Dr. Oliver, and he was a pathologist, but he was a senior research fellow. And all he did was write his book on the kidney and dissect whale kidneys and things like this. He didn't do anything really for the company. But this is the same company that had these very famous medical illustrations, the Nader atlases. And he was a pathologist, but he didn't do anything for the company except put out these atlases. So I became their pathologist. Then they later combined with Geigy Pharmaceutical Company, and it was known as Ciba Geigy. But they had a principle there of early retirement. When your service with the company plus your age equals 65, you could retire early. And so when I hit 15 years with the company plus the 52, I took early retirement.
Magic number. Now, while you were there, you did, more than just pathology work again. You were involved. One of the things you were involved with was the use of computers for collecting pathology data.
Right. I designed a computer system that was based upon our computer system in Denver. But the computers we had in Denver, remember Flexowriters, paper tape?
Absolutely.
Well, these things were gigantic. We didn't have terminals beside the microscope. It all had to go in by hand to a Flexowriter and come off on tape. But when we got to Ciba, I found that I had a very good computer section there. And so working with them, we designed a system for putting their data up on computer with the terminals beside the microscopes and the like. And after I retired, because I was the one who was troubleshooting on this one, after I retired, they looked into putting in some other system where they could get service on it from the software company, but they never did. And basically, I think they're still using it. Maybe not since they have combined with Sandoz, because Sandoz had its own system. But that's where I got into computers. And if anyone had ever told me that I would be able to play with computers, I would 20 years ago, I would have said, you've got to have rocks in your head.
Absolutely. Now, you were there for 15 years. You became a senior research fellow.
Right.
Like Dr. Oliver.
Like Dr. Oliver.
But I'm sure doing something of much more merit.
I wrote a book.
Another book.
Right. And this was on the adrenal medulla of the rat.
Okay, that's what that.
And in defense of reserpine.
Okay.
And SIBA no longer made reserpine, but when it came up on the bioassay program that reserpine was causing pheochromocytomas in animals, we at SIBA thought that's a biological impossibility because reserpine suppresses catecholamine synthesis. The two don't go together.
Absolutely.
So we got very interested in it. My wife Vladislava worked on the project with us. We came down and reread all their bioassays and examined all the tissues and took pictures of every one of them. And I used a lot of these pictures we took as illustrations in the book about the adrenal medulla of the rat. And then I started to work on correlations and statistics. And they always used to tell me that there was always a high incidence of not pheochromocytomas, pituitary adenomas with mammary tumors in rats. There isn't. I mean, statistically. It's because somebody gets an impression that they're looking at 1 or 2 or 3 of the most frequently occurring tumors in these animals, that there's some correlation between their occurrence, and that isn't necessarily so statistically. And so we analyzed all of these supposed fables of what always goes with what, and went back through all the tissues that we had on file in our archives at SIBA, and did statistics on them. And statistically proved there weren't correlations on many of these things.
Okay, well, we're up through, and that's a very important time because we want to talk about the STP. We also want to talk about C.L. Davis. Both came to fruition then. I wanted to, before I got in there, I was looking through your books and journals, which we talked several, but there are a couple that caught my eye, and I sort of wanted to ask you a little bit about them. I think this would be appropriate, and then we'll start talking about the STP.
Okay.
You didn't wait long to publish your first paper, 1945, on ascorbic acid therapy.
I wrote that when I was a senior in veterinary school. And of course we put out the veterinary student, tried to write scientific articles, but ascorbic acid interested me at the time because we were talking about humans weren't getting enough ascorbic acid in their diet. Animals don't either. And it is essential.
And this was your experience in treating animals, or?
My experience of reviewing the literature and also with listening to my professor of pharmacology, who was a very famous gentleman, Elmira Jones. And I think Elmira Jones is the only person I know who served as dean of 3 different veterinary schools.
Interesting. Yeah, most pathologists these days wait until, 10th year or whatever to write their paper, and here you are churning one out as a senior veterinary student. You had a couple on, and there are a lot of histochemical papers. One that come up is leiomyometaplasts.
I wrote that here at the AFIP.
Several, two papers on that. Yeah.
Right. And what had happened, remember the name Ernest Goodpasture?
Yes, I do.
He was the scientific director here, and he had been the former dean at Vanderbilt. I never went to Vanderbilt, but I had a lot of good friends there. And so I saw these things in cats and in dogs, and the smooth muscle and then the spleen. And I took them upstairs and played with them with Frank Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of guided me through what I was doing. And then I took him down to show him to Dr. Goodpasture. And Dr. Goodpasture said, well, to his way of thinking, this was a new entity that we could characterize it that far, because they used to call it brown dog gut,
Right.
which doesn't tell you anything. It needs to either be in brown dogs or...
That's right.
So,
Very descriptive name.
very descriptive name. So I was going to call them myometaplasm, just meaning muscle particles.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Goodpasture said, no, he thought the better name would be leiomyometaplasm. And so he named them.
And we still call it leiomyometaplasm, and they're lipofuscin, correct?
They're lipofuscin. But what they used to say, well, this is due to vitamin E deficiency. Well, they occur in humans in diabetics. And I don't know if all human diabetics have a vitamin E deficiency.
You've also written, I guess while you were here, an article on intranuclear inclusions in the liver and kidney of dogs, the crystalline inclusions we're so familiar with.
Right. Well, they intrigued me, and so I was playing around with the protein stains at the time, which I feature quite heavily in my book, dinitrofluorobenzene, DDD, etc. So I tried them out on it, and they come up being disulfides, strongly sulfhydryl groups, and so they're protein crystals. And later, a friend of mine, who I think we all know, Ward Richter, reported on them electron microscopically and confirmed that they were what we said they were from histochemistry.
I think these days you would probably be heavy into the immunohistochemistry, but you know, this was the state-of-the-art diagnostics back then, what you were doing with histochemistry. I don't think we should go any further without mentioning Lee Luna, who was your collaborator on the book.
Oh, and he was a very, very dear friend. I'll tell you why. Lee Luna was a sergeant in the Army the first time I was here at the AFIP, and he was just in charge of the veterinary section of the histology laboratory. The next time I came back, Lee Luna, good Colorado boy, was, he'd taken Ambrosia's position when Ambrosia retired. He was in charge of the entire histo laboratory. And we got to talking one day about artifacts. And we wondered how many women had lost their breasts because of artifacts. And a few other things that we know. So we started collecting artifacts. We had to use histochemistry to prove they were artifacts, but Lee Luna and I, he was here and I was at SIBA, and we wrote the Atlas of Artifacts, and he used to come up to my home in Morristown on weekends, and we would work together on the book. And he took had the photography done for the Atlas here at the AFIP, and we dedicated the book to a very dear friend of ours. Do you happen to know who that was?
No, I haven't seen the book, seen the dedication. We do have a copy.
The dedication was due to another scientific director of the AFIP that was scientific director at that time. He wasn't scientific director while I was here. And I'm trying to think of his name. That's why I was asking if you knew it.
It's okay. I think we can research that one at the break.
Right.
Other histochemical investigations, cloisonné kidney. Did you just see these interesting lesions and say, hey, I wonder?
I saw these interesting lesions and wondered, what is it? Reminds me of Robert Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
Some people see something and ask why, and I ask why not. But with cloisonné kidney, Don Yost got me interested in this because they were using goats out at Edgewood.
Mm-hmm.
And these goats were coming from the Edwards Plateau area of Texas. I began to wonder why if there was some reason. Edwards Plateau is very similar to this plateau up in Ontario. It's just a great big underground lake. All these animals were being fed by artesian water. And so Don and I wondered what these were. And I was at the laboratory in Denver, finally, and he was sending me every one that he found at Edgewood. Then he came out and spent a week in my laboratory, and we ran all these histochemical screenings, and we read the slides, and we wrote the paper that week. And by the way, it sticks. I mean, the chemical classification of what it is.
It's still the same. Just one other, and we've talked about the intravenous administration. There's a tremendous body of work that you put together, and on irradiated foods. You also did a little work, the histochemical analysis, probably the first one of amyloid, which we're all very familiar with, and it's all the rage these days.
Oh, well, I in thinking of amyloid, you know, there's lots of concepts of what amyloid was. And I looked at it and I said, I thought it probably was protein, and we proved it. And they were calling it an antigen-antibody reaction, a whole host of things. But basically, what is it chemically? And that has stuck. Then we went on to apply the same stains to rabies and improve what the Negri body was. And it isn't just a little blue dot.
Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Society for Toxicological Pathology, how that got started, and the C.L. Davis Foundation.
My pleasure.
Terrific. Hello again. I'm Bruce Williams. I'm here with my friend Sam Thompson. This is the third tape in our series on the Legends of Veterinary Pathology with Sam Thompson. We have 1 hour left. We want to talk about the way that you have touched more pathologists, been a mentor, been a career developer for more veterinary pathologists than anyone I can think of. You are one of the co-founders of the Society for Toxicological Pathologists, as well as C.L. Davis Foundation. And who better to give us a view into how they actually got started? I know there are probably a lot of stories out there, but maybe this is your chance to set the record straight. Let's start while you were at SEBA with the Society for Toxicological Pathology and go into that. You, of course, were one of the presidents, served on the advisory council, but you were instrumental in the formation of that society. And I'm going to let you tell us how it all came to be.
Well, after Howard Hartman at Sandoz had taken the board examinations and passed them, he came over to SEBA one day to see me and walked to my office and said, "Now what?" Meaning we had been meeting together 2 or 3 nights a month while he was preparing for the boards. So we decided that we would invite the heads of departments, pathology departments, of the regional chemical companies. There was Sandoz, SEBA, Geigy, Squibb, Hoffman, LaRoche,
all in New Jersey.
in New Jersey area. Why don't we meet for lunch once a month? So we met for lunch the first time, and surprisingly, Bill Fields, which I think most veterinary pathologists know, came. Bob Van Ryzen, who was a cadet in the veterinary ROTC at Iowa State when I was PMS&T. Howard Hartman. Robert Diener, who was a sergeant at the Denver laboratory before he went to veterinary school. Let's see, Hans Kaiser, who was at Squibb, and I may be missing some of them. Dan Sassmore was out at a private testing laboratory, which is biodynamics, and I think he was there. And it was a nice luncheon, and we decided to do it again. And at the time we did it again, Nelson Irie and Hamish Innes were visiting me, and we invited them. So now this gets to be the basic group. There was one more individual from Pfizer, and I can't recall his name. I never knew him that well, and we later included one more, Claude Biava, who was a vice president of Abbott Laboratories. And he actually came all the way out from Abbott to have lunch with us.
Abbott was still in Chicago.
Right.
Okay.
And so this was the initial group. And after we had lunch then, we decided that we were really getting too big, and we should be meeting and using the auditorium facilities of our various companies. The thought was they'll never let us discuss common problems in drug testing and the like. And the fact is, they did. And we started meeting at Squibb and at Letterly and at the other pharmaceutical companies once a month. And it got to where we had about 40 or 50 attending. And Hans Kaiser got up one day at the meeting and said, I think we ought to incorporate and make it a society. And everybody said that was fine, so they asked me, Howard Hartman, Van Ryzen, Diener, Nelson Irie, who was from the AFIP, Claude Biava, and John McCoy from Rutgers University. Now, the reason people may know John McCoy is he's a veterinarian, but he was trained as a human pathologist. He has a PhD in pathology. And he also was president of the AVMA. So we started meeting quite regularly, drawing up just a small group, drawing up a bylaws, constitution, articles of incorporation for a society. And we used a lawyer, who was my lawyer in Summit, to get this through the state. And we became the Society of Environmental and Toxicologic Pathologists. I had always liked the idea of the environment, and but nobody else seemed to. I think there is such a thing as environmental pathology. I think dioxin is one of the biggest examples of environmental pathology. So they soon voted to change the name, shorten it, to Society of Toxicologic Pathologists. And Hans Kaiser served as our first president. I was president-elect, and I served as our second president. And I think each one of these people served as president, except Hamish Innes, because he died. Mm-hmm. Nelson Irie served as president, and we met here at the AFIP, in the Washington area, at NIH, at National Library of Medicine, and at the various pharmaceutical concerns. And it became probably the strongest influence in pathology in industry.
And it certainly still is.
And it still is, and now the AFIP is quite involved with them, with the Registry of Toxicologic Pathology. And we took in people, not only in industry, but people in government. Richardson, who was killed in a plane accident in Australia, was a very famous pathologist and friend of Nelson's. He and his wife were killed in a plane accident in Australia, but he was a senior pathologist for the EPA at the time. And then, after about the time I retired from SIBA and went into work for Food and Drug Research Laboratories for 1 year, then went into private practice. And while I was at Food and Drug Research Laboratories, the society made me an honored member, which I guess means they retired me. You know, but, and my dear friend Van Ryzen is now dead. He was the senior pathologist at Sandoz.
There is an anecdote in a speech that you gave at your induction about another group at the same time as it was founded at the IAP in Mexico City.
Yes, that was Nelson Irie and Claude Biava and Hans Kaiser were all at the IAP meeting in Mexico City.
And I think Cash Mustofi.
Yeah, right. Well, he was always at him. And getting Montezuma's revenge, I'm sure, but and they thought there should be some type of organization that was devoted to toxicologic pathology. Now, the reason for it is pathology generally winds up being a situation where you make the diagnosis one by one by one. This is what this animal died from. This is what this animal died from. The toxicologic pathologist really is looking at a population of animals, and maybe none of them die. He is comparing what are the differences between the one which received a toxic agent and an equal population that did not. And it's truly comparative. And so he may be quite excited over a change that you would look at and say, oh, this isn't the cause of death, so you pass on. And so it's just a different attitude. And we thought that it would be good to have an organization that was devoted to this type of practice of pathology. And when I had known Nelson Irie for years and years and years, he also was quite active in the Davis Foundation. And we talked about it, but never seemed to get around to doing anything about it for about 3 or 4 years until we started having these lunches. So I think this is Hans Kaiser had in mind when he made the suggestion we should incorporate. But that really made us the founders, because it was the people who incorporated were the ones I named. Mm-hmm. And then we let everybody else join.
It's interesting that back at that time, seemed to be a lot more collaboration between human and veterinary pathologists than there is now, because you, of course, are a member of the International Academy of Pathology, which is primary human organization. Dr. I was very involved in the C.L. Davis Foundation. I don't see that quite as much anymore, do you?
No, unfortunately I don't. But we used to have some very famous MDs that used to lecture for the Davis Foundation. There was a gentleman who was an electron microscopist back at the University of Chicago, quite famous. Whistler.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of these people. But they, for some reason or other, I seem to think that the MDs are not quite as interested in the animal species as they should be, because they're all doing research, and they certainly have to evaluate these animals. And the rat is not a little human being. Neither is the mouse.
Absolutely. Well, we have touched on it throughout the last two tapes, and I think it's time that we bring up the foundation itself, how the foundation started. Hopefully we can get you to explain the crest, which you so proudly wear on your jacket. And I guess back in 1970s when it started, and you were there, the foundation for you. Foundation has been, under your leadership since its inception. It has done extremely well from humble beginnings. I certainly would have to credit you and your force of will for bringing it to where it is today. And I think not only myself, but so many other pathologists owe you a debt of gratitude for helping in our training. And then after we were able to get certified or our PhDs through the foundation, we have achieved maybe a little bit of notoriety or something else, and I want to thank you.
I brag about you to everybody I know.
But to me, C.L. Davis Foundation represents all that's good in veterinary pathology and all that's noble, because so many people have volunteered over the years. No one gets paid to be part of the C.L. Davis Foundation. Nobody. All we get out of it is, an audience and a way to exercise our love of teaching. With that said, I want to spend the rest of our time talking about how it started and touch on some of the traditions of the foundation.
Well, I'll tell you how it got started. I had written a recommendation to the council of the ACVP to name Charlie Davis as a distinguished member when they started that program, and they agreed. Well, he was their third president, and they all knew him then. Back in those days, we didn't have this many members. And so he came to the meeting, and we gave him the plaque in Chicago and the like. And then he died in about 2 more months. Rather unexpected. And this was 1972, I think. And his daughter, whom you have met, Stella Mae Hyman, and his son, Richard Samuel Davis, got together, and they put $1,500 together, and they set up a foundation at the First Tennessee Bank. And they asked T.C. Jones, Charlie Barron, Rue Jensen, who was, I think, the first veterinary pathologist to wind up being president of a university, Sam Thompson, and Ronald Duncan Hunt, to be an advisory committee to disperse this $1,500. And I remember that it was at an IAP meeting in Cincinnati, and right after that, and T.C. Jones and Ron Hunt and I met in my hotel room, and we decided $1,500 wasn't going to do much for anybody, so why give it away? Let's try and devise something we can do which would help a lot of people in pathology. And so we started holding these training sessions once a month in Summit, New Jersey, in Chicago, Illinois. Ward Richter was running it. In Los Angeles, California, Los Angeles County Health. There was another very well-known veterinary pathologist who was out there. I wish I could think of his name. Why names escape me, I don't know. And so we did. And we asked people like Art Hurwitz, Garner, John King, McEntee, Tyler, Farrell. We could take all of the educators and people we knew who liked to lecture, and we asked them to prepare, Carlton, asked them to prepare 4 hours on their favorite subject. And we spent a little bit of our money on plane fares. Back in the early days, they paid their own way to go do this. We didn't think that was right. So we decided to become a dues-paying organization. And since that time, I guess, through dues and registration fees, we have raised and dispersed over $3 million training veterinary pathologists.
That's amazing. Now, you know, back in the early days, and of course, the Hymans, they went to 5 of the most prominent pathologists. They were certainly aiming high, and they scored a mark there. You were able to go out, the 5 of you, when you were setting up the initial faculty of discussants, to pick the absolute cream of the crop here in the country.
Oh, they are.
And the faculty of discussants still is the cream of the crop of the educators in the country. And I guess one thing you say that you wanted to become I think in the 70, 73, somewhere in there, you became a dues-paying organization. The first year, how many members were there in the C.L. Davis Foundation?
First year, there were 5 members in the C.L. Davis.
Dues paying?
No, we didn't pay anything. We had that $1,500.
That took care of your dues. Okay.
Right. But since then, I would have to say all members are dues paying, because either the institution pays for them or they pay individually. So we now have 2,000 members in 55 countries of the world. And we put on symposia in Africa each year, Europe, 3 of them in the United States.
And it certainly is an international-based organization.
Right.
Now, the faculty of discussants, the term faculty of discussants, I want to get into that, because I guess we'll bring up Mount Pemble Lake and how first meetings were
Well, we didn't want these professors that we were asking to do this just to come down and me, Professor, me, Tarzan, you, Jane, you're dumb. Because the people we had were already all DVMs, many of them PhDs that were coming to these meetings. So we thought we would use the term faculty because faculty members like to be called faculty. But discussants, meaning they're coming there to discuss with you. You get the feedback also. And to this day, this happens. We elicit response from the audience and input and experience and knowledge. And so that's where the name Faculty of Discussants.
It was, and the discussants were all very well educated in their own right, and the discussion must have been absolutely fascinating.
Oh, yes.
People of this stature. If
you want to know who were some of the Faculty of Discussants, outside of the last 2 directors of the Department of Veterinary Pathology, all of them have been members of the faculty, have gone all over the world. to Europe and to lecturing for us. Harris didn't, but I don't think Harris lectures much.
It doesn't.
And the current one isn't, because he has far more duties than any of the previous
Absolutely.
heads of department. You know, I understand he's a deputy director of the
Institute.
the institute and the like. But we have members of the Department of Veterinary Pathology on our faculty. We have you. Dana lectures for us. I imagine Joe Lynn is going to lecture for us.
Sure. But to
who
go
was
back
that?
to Mount Pemble Lake, which was your home.
Oh,
the
that was my
first
home.
meetings took place actually in your home.
Right, they did, because I had a study there and we had no place to meet. And so for the first year we met in my study. And I'll give you some examples of the type of people that were coming to this. Besides Art Hurwitz and Hamish Innes and Garner and King, can you imagine being able to sit and
That's what I find totally amazing.
discuss with these? We had Dave Sullivan came to that. Not as a lecturer, as a...
Just sitting in your living room.
Right. Kanisevich.
Mm-hmm.
What? Let me see. Dinesh Sinha. He's with Sharing Plow. Diener. Hartman.
I'll interrupt you here because I think it's...
In other words, they were people who later went on to become heads of departments.
Absolutely. I think we have to talk about Howard here. You know, throughout, you know, the formation of STP and CL Davis, Howard has always been involved, been there at your side.
I don't know what I'd do without Howard. I don't even want to think about it.
Absolutely. And he's been the treasurer of the STP, secretary-treasurer. And we'll talk about the correspondence division, but Howard, to me, is the fellow who works behind the scenes, doing the things that absolutely have to be done, like yourself, but taking very little credit. What would you like to say about Howard right now?
Well, he has organized a form which we call the correspondence division, and these are fairly substantial size study sets, and it isn't just what garbage got put together or left over. This is highly organized. Over 2,000 pathologists have contributed materials to this. And they have circulated around the major points of training of pathologists, veterinary pathologists in the United States. They used to circulate to Canada till the Canadians gave us trouble, and also to Europe till various customs officers decided we should be paying for the privilege of educating their citizens. But these study sets have rotated for over 20 years. They've traveled millions upon millions of miles. I would say 4 or 5 million miles. We've never lost any. The departments at the various schools or institutes take care of them and get them on to the next station within 30 days. And he has 50 of these sets so that they don't get the same set year after year. It's rotated in. And he does all this himself.
That's right, and there's no secretary, and he does it himself, and it's amazing. And these are not sets that, you know, were put together 30 years ago and they haven't changed. He continually adds them, he has new material, he swaps the cases out. And
now then, you want to know what type of material is in it? We have representative through that set. Every seminar the ACVP ever gave when they used to have slide seminars, all of the Wednesday slide conferences since they started having them, these are within the sets. And I would think that's quite an accomplishment, and yet Howard has organized study sets that have about 4,000 specimens in them, And these are deposited at centers where anyone can go study them. One of them is at the AFIP.
And the other ones are?
The other one is at the Bronx Zoo and at the University of Illinois at Chicago. We've just dispatched one to the University of Wisconsin. We have one at the County Veterinarian's Office in San Diego. And we have one at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. And we have another one, or we're setting one up at NIEHS in Research Triangle Park. Now these are government agencies, government facilities, academic facilities, and local government facilities. And they are well attended.
The courses that the foundation puts on every year are in almost their 30th year. I think next year we'll be having the 30th annual gross symposium on gross morbid anatomy of the diseases of animals. And people always ask me why we don't shorten the name.
Why shouldn't we?
Absolutely, why should we? It's been holding in good stead. We had 120 people last year.
Right. Do you know who was the first one to put that on for us?
I do not.
Farrell Robinson, when he was director here. And since that time, we've had such distinguished people as Hal Casey, Farrell Robinson,
Dr. Garner?
Dr. Garner, you ran the things, Dana Scott.
Rob Moeller, Dana
Rob
Scott.
Moeller.
It's always been one of the pleasures of being the training officer at AFIP is being able to run that course every year, because all you have to do is mention the C.L. Davis Foundation and the speakers line up to come. I think it's a badge of honor.
You treat them nicely.
For the speakers.
And of course, I think it helps the fact that we are able to rotate the speakers to Europe after they have served long and faithfully. They get to go overseas and to Africa. So these are good in rewards.
Absolutely, but I think most of the people, when Sam Thompson calls, do it because the foundation has helped them achieve whatever status they have, whether it's board certification or any notoriety, and we will continue to do that. We're running short on time. I know we're not too far off, but I do want to ask a couple things. I want to wind up with a couple things. Number one, could you explain the origin of the crest? And hopefully we can get this on camera. Maybe if you can turn just a little bit.
Well,
they can see
I guess.
Zoom in on the crest here.
The origin of the crest, I think.
What it means.
The green border stands for the Veterinary Corps, which is the color of the Veterinary Corps. Dr. Davis was a major in the Veterinary Corps. The snake stands for medicine. The red V stands for veterinary. The three Baileys stand for pathology. Well, they really stand for Egyptian mummies, but it has been a long accepted symbol of the pathologist. The AFIP has bay leaves in their crest. The ACVP has bay leaves in their crest. The white is purity and honesty, which I believe pathologists are.
Absolutely.
Tell it like it is. But basically, I was having trouble drawing the bay leaves. And I went to the wife of a former Army officer and a retired colonel in the reserve, Woody. And his wife was somewhat of an artist, and I said, I can't seem to get these things to look right. So she sketched in the bay leaves for us. And that's basically the concept of the crest. And it reminds us who we are and who Charles Davis was. Incidentally, he was the first veterinary pathologist to ever head veterinary pathology at the AFIP back in the days when it was the Army Medical Museum.
That's true, and that's why we here at AFIP have a special bond with the foundation.
Right.
And we've been involved over the years, and we continue to remain involved and to cherish the ideals of the foundation. One thing I do want to bring up, and it's very important, doesn't have much to do with veterinary pathology, but an important part for every successful person is family, somebody or people who assist them, keep them going. You've been blessed to have had 2 fantastic ladies in your life.
That's right.
And 3 children.
That's right. Don't know how I was so fortunate.
Barbara, Maggie, and Sam Jr.
Right.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about Barbara Jean?
Well, Barbara Jean was quite active in the foundation.
She was.
And she was National Program Secretary. And they gave her an award in Denver, which she didn't know about. They used to call her the Den Mother. You know, she was a dear friend of Charlie Barron's, too. But she died of coronary. She'd had a cardiac bypass operation.
Mm-hmm.
The cardiologist said that she had a good 7 years after this. And when the 8th year came, we thought we'd beat it. But she died in the 8th year.
And she was also a military wife and went with you to Guam, where Barbara was born in Guam, correct?
Barbara was born in Guam. And for fear they would blow up the Hall of Records on Guam, I traveled with her birth certificate all the way to Jefferson City, Missouri. And Harry Truman brought me back for my aunt, who was very ill at the time, and General Means, who had been the commander of the National Guard in Missouri, took me to Jefferson City, and we registered her birth certificate there. And Sam was born right here in that marvelous hospital they tore down. And Maggie, where was Maggie?
Japan, wasn't it?
Maggie was born on Guam. And we used to claim that Barbie was born out in California at Camp Cook. The attending physician was the MOD, medical officer of the day, the psychiatrist. Maggie was born at the Naval Hospital on Guam. MOD attending, none of them arrived during normal duty hours. And the OD was an ear, nose, and throat specialist. Sam was the only one who actually had OBGYN specialist.
And of course, nowadays it's Sam and Blatty. We talk.
That's right.
There's never Sam, it's Sam and Blatty, Sam and Blatty. And you've known Vladislava now for how long? But when you were at SIBA, you met.
She used to attend the Davis Foundation meetings in Chicago. And then she came to work at SIBA, and she worked in my department. And then she went to ITRI, I believe, Illinois Institute of Technology or Institute or something like that, in Chicago as head of pathology. And we met at meetings and so forth. And after Barbara died, why I looked up this pathologist I felt rather highly about, and we decided to, that's when I went into consulting practice.
You had collaborated on papers before and
Right.
professionally, and then you became
We collaborated on a book.
And on a book too.
Right, so we decided to become collaborators. But
Good
my
team.
daughters teased me that when we were in practice together, I would be introducing Vladislava as my associate, Dr. Rock. Well, I mean, we were trying to impress clients, you know. there were two other associates in the practice, McGavin and Lee Cira.
And of course now, Vladdy, is the secretary-treasurer of the foundation. She keeps us in the black instead of in the red.
That's right, and she sure goes over practically every bill that comes in. We have to, because we have to make out the report annually to the IRS, and they closely scrutinize foundations, as they should.
Absolutely. Well, no one's going to mess with Vladdy.
Okay, no.
I always have, or we often have one question which we save for the end.
What?
Basically, one day when Sam is not around, what do you want to be remembered for? You've done so many things in your career. Your CV weighs a pound. You've formed the STP and the CL Davis, and you have children and family. What things are you the most proud of that you want
What would I like to be remembered
Absolutely. You'll be remembered for a host of things, but
I would really rather be remembered that I tried to be a friend to a large number of people, tried to be a good Christian.
Absolutely. The foundation will continue on for many years. It's a global, certainly a global enterprise.
Oh, I haven't mentioned all the officers.
We'd be here all day if we did
We'd be here all day. There are 120 of them, but we have Bruce Williams as a vice president, Howard Hartman as a vice president, Tracy McNamara at the Bronx Zoo as a vice president, Don Kelly of the University of Liverpool as a vice president. We've got talent.
Absolutely.
And dedicated people, and I like to boast to people that no one receives a nickel in compensation.
Well,
I hope you have received your compensation for what you are able to do for others.
Many times over, and as someone who, I've known you far shorter time than most of the people we've talked about today. Someone who has spent time with the foundation. Someone who would like to let you know that, while I embrace all the tenets of the foundation, the sustaining part and what keeps myself and most of the people that you've named working with the foundation is the privilege of working with Sam Thompson, someone who has dedicated such a part of his life to the foundation.
Well, I'm going to blush, but it's probably from the heat.
And who leads by example. It's the leadership and the example you set for us that
those are very kind words. I appreciate it.
Keeps us working, and will keep us working.
Because there's an old saying, flattery will get you everywhere. It's good.
If we may have a minute or two, if there's anyone that you would like to mention, it's difficult to bring up everybody. If there anyone that you
want
to
it definitely is. But I have not mentioned Annette Gendron Fitzpatrick, and she's the editor of our newsletter and vice president of our foundation and runs our awards program where we recognize outstanding teachers of pathology and outstanding residents of pathology, and Steve Dempsey, who's a vice president, and he is in our what we call development. In other words, he helps me raise money.
Absolutely, and that's very important. And what you've done with the raising the money has allowed the rest of us to concentrate on the teaching aspects, and it's made it so much easier for us to do.
We hope that we've been successful to the point that all of you know exactly what your budgets are for the year, or we hope they will be. And as long as you're within budget, there's nobody from our office looking over your shoulder.
We recently lost Dr. Farrell. I want to mention
Bob
Farrell.
Bob Farrell. Beautiful man.
Certainly had a tremendous impact on me when I was at the University
He's
of
the one
Georgia.
who got me to give up smoking.
And thank you, Dr. Farrell.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. That was years ago. And I haven't smoked for years.
John King, when he came in here 2 years ago to do his tape, he said that whenever you talked, he felt like saluting. Here's your chance to answer John King.
Oh, John King is, I've known him for years. Ever since I gave this, I was the program for the ACVP the year that President Kennedy was assassinated. It was on histochemistry, and I gave it. And John King heckled. He said from the audience, if you can't make a diagnosis with H&E, you can't make a diagnosis. And I agree with him. But why do you have to do things the hard way? You know? And he uses special stains now too. But
he's been a good friend of the foundation. And
oh, he has. And he has done many things to help support it financially, to raise money, and the like. Did I ever tell you the story that John King was going to go to China? And they decided that they would parcel up the Olafson course, who would run it at Cornell. But it worked out that McEntee went off to Illinois and somebody else went someplace else, and there wasn't any. And the foundation brought John King back from Taiwan to run the Olafson course, and it wasn't our course.
The one person I also want to mention was George McGockey.
Oh, George McGockey did marvelous things for us, particularly when he was here at the AFIP and the Registry of Pathology. But basically, he keeps us very honest and democratic, because everyone says on these elections, did you stuff the ballot box? I can't, because all of the ballots go to George. You know,
Well,
and he is so very honest.
terrific. Well, we are out of time, I hear. I want to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for taking the time, since you're here in Washington, allow us to tape you. I know we've been